Welcome to the Reason Stream. I'm Liz Wolfe, joined by my co-host, Zach Weissmuller. We're live today, so please feel to throw any questions that you might have in the chat. We're looking forward to getting to some of your questions, hopefully providing some pretty good answers. Today, we're talking about Javier Milei, the self-described libertarian economist running for president of Argentina. He surprised the world with a first place finish in the primaries this summer, but in a runoff this past Sunday, he came in second to Sergio Massa, the Minister of Economy for Argentina's ruling party. Milei and Massa will face voters once again on November 19th. So, does Milei still have a chance? Joining us to offer insights into Argentine politics is Marcos Falcone, a political scientist, project manager at Argentina's Fundación Libertad, and podcast host. Marcos, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Zach. Thank you for the invite.
Hey.
Yeah. Let's look at what happened in this most recent election. What exactly do you think explains this outcome, Marcos?
Yeah, so this was a surprise to us, just as the August primaries had been a surprise. In Argentina, we have this system where primaries are held at the same time for all parties, and voting is compulsory. So this is why we can compare the primaries to the general election that took place this past Sunday. In August, we had seen Milei win with 30% of the vote. He was ahead of the other two coalitions that actually had primaries. Milei faced no one within his coalition. But this time, although everyone expected that there would be a second ballot, which is going to take place November 19th, most people expected Milei to win again and get more votes than Sergio Massa, the current Minister of Economy, or Patricia Bullrich, former Minister of Security. He ended up getting fewer votes than Massa. Massa got 30% of the vote. Milei got 30, which is the same basically as the primaries. And this came as a shock. It seems to me that there are two main reasons why this was the case. First, Milei's campaign has not been the most professional one. He has talked about issues that are sort of out of touch with the Argentine public that may be of true interest to us libertarians, such as, whether organs could be sold or bought, but that people is not really interested in at the moment.
Of course they should be. Why is that controversial?
Right. But the thing is, his opponents actually attacked him for things like that. And that probably took a dent on his candidacy. And then just, overall, there was this fear campaign that if Milei won, he would be the sort of fascist, who would be a danger for democracy, just like people in the US talked about Donald Trump in recent years, or people in Brazil talked about Jair Bolsonaro. Milei was described as this very dangerous person who should not be president. So this is the reason why I think it was Massa particularly who got more votes, because Milei was sort of competing with the rest of the opposition for the anti-government vote. He won that. If you take that as a primary, as another primary, say, then he won that because he beat Patricia Bullrich, who will not be in the second ballot. But the government sort of consolidated its support and got more votes, I think, because of this fear campaign, and because it tried to avoid economics, basically, because the presidential candidate is the Minister of Economy, but our economy is in shambles right now. We have a 140% annual inflation rate, an ongoing recession, poverty rates that are through the roof. So it was smart of the government to try to avoid the economic themes and just focus on how dangerous Milei would be. And I think that's the reason why they got more votes.
But it wasn't just this fear campaign, right? Like Massa also engaged in a little bit of, I would say, not exactly trickery, but almost like bribing people to vote for him when it really got down to the wire. I was even reading a little bit about how, people would show up to bus stations and train stations and see the government basically communicating, oh, if Milei, comes into power, then here is how much your ticket will actually be, because it'll no longer be subsidized by the government, and he'll slash all of these programs, which is a fairly compelling pitch to people who are struggling financially. Could you tell us a little bit about what was this very slimy campaign that Massa was running?
Yeah, I mean, it was all very sketchy, and it wasn't just that. For people who haven't been to Argentina, bus tickets, train tickets, subway tickets are highly subsidized, particularly in Buenos Aires. And so a bus ride can cost something like 7 cents of a dollar, when the true price should be something like $1. And so who's paying for that? Of course, taxpayers. It's only indirectly that they're paying for that with, for example, this monstrous inflation rate that we have. But it's not something that you pay directly. And so what the government did was they actually installed signs that said, if without a subsidy, you would be paying 10 times what you're paying today, which was a very, not a direct, but a very clear reference to the fiscal adjustment that both Milei and Bullrich were proposing. Something else that Minister Massa did was he actually cut taxes in these past 2 months, which is something that a leftist Peronist government, as we call it here, would never do. But this time they did do it. Minister Massa sort of slashed income tax for, actually, this was mostly for people who are high earners in Argentina, but he basically slashed it. And he also implemented, they passed a law that Minister Massa sent to Congress, which would, and which is effective now, and sort of gives money back to taxpayers, the VAT tax. It gives it back basically to consumers who use their debit card in supermarkets and grocery stores. So there were lots of measures put in place by the government, which are already fueling inflation, because the September rate, for example, was 12.7%, which was the highest monthly rate in 30 years in Argentina.
Wow, really?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
massive.
I know, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And before that, in August, we had surpassed our record again. So this is like a continuous thing. Every month we get higher inflation than the previous one, and it is in part because of these measures. They weren't enough to sort of calm markets down. There still was a run against the peso right before the election, for people to get a sense of what the exchange rate is here. Right after the August primaries, the dollar was trading at something like 600 pesos. But right before the election, this past Sunday, the dollar was trading at something like 1,000 pesos. So there was definitely a run against the peso, which Minister Massa was unable to contain. But still, these measures that he took, these very populist measures, we're used to them. That's probably why I didn't even mention them in the first place, because we see that happen repeatedly, and regardless of who the president is, of what their political affiliation is, they all try to implement measures that will get them the most votes right before the election. In the case of Massa, it was tax cuts, which alongside this fear campaign, I think were very effective.
So you could say Milei has already delivered his first tax cut just through the fear of his election by his political opponents. But what when Milei,
that's actually, I'm sorry, that's actually what he said, because he has two seats in Congress right now. Yeah, he has 2 seats in Congress. One of them is actually him. And he actually voted in favor of the tax cuts, and he told people, this was actually his doing all around, that he was forcing Massa to cut taxes through his agenda. So he did that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the giving out of all the other goodies, obviously, terrible policy amidst an inflation crisis. Right after Milei came, kind of surprisingly came in first this summer in the initial primary, there was a market there's some panic in the market, and you wrote about this for National Review at the time and said that morning markets opened in panic mode. Local ADR saw declines of up to 14% before making a partial comeback. On the same day, the government devalued the national currency by 22% in just 2 days. The unofficial exchange rate rose from 600 to 780 pesos per dollar.
Does unofficial
How
exchange rate mean black
Yeah.
market exchange rate?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have
Cool.
multiple exchange rates, but I can go on. I can go over that later.
I just wanted to clarify. Zach can get to his question. I just wanted to clarify because unofficial
Right.
exchange rate might be confusing for people who don't know
Yeah,
about
no,
Argentina.
that's a good clarification. Why did that happen right after the kind of surprise victory, or not victory, but first place finish by Milei?
Yeah, so that's kind of paradoxical, right? Because you would expect a pro-market candidate to get the confidence of the market, but the thing is, Milei's campaign was not really being taken seriously by markets, by the public in general, just because he was not polling above 20%, 15% in most polls, and so everyone expected him to be a very important, like a key figure, particularly in terms of congressional support for the next president, but nobody expected him to become the next president. And I don't think he was even expecting the August result when he came in first. So I think because of all of this, his proposals were not priced in sort of the local currency or bonds or stocks. And his main proposal back then and still now was that of dollarization. Dollarization means basically getting rid of the peso, which is our national currency, and just declaring that the dollar will be the legal tender in Argentina. This has been done in other Latin American countries like Ecuador, Panama, but it has not been done in as big a country as Argentina. So this would be a very interesting experiment. But one of the criticisms, the main criticism of that plan is that the central bank in Argentina has negative reserves right now. So it has no dollars, basically. It's indebted. And so the key issue that you need to solve before dollarizing is that of the exchange rate. If suddenly you're going to get rid of the peso and everyone's going to start using dollars, then what's the exchange rate, the final exchange rate, going to be? And because the central bank has no dollars, criticism of Milei was that the exchange rate would have to be extremely high to account for these very few dollars that the state has. But if that happens, then that is very likely to trigger hyperinflation, particularly in an economy that already has chronically high inflation. And so the fear, in my opinion, right after the August primaries, was that Milei was actually going to win the general election or the second ballot, that he would dollarize, but that the central bank would still have no dollars, which would trigger chaos basically in the economy. And we know that markets like market-friendly policies, but they hate uncertainty and they hate not knowing what's going to happen or how that's going to happen. And back then, in August, it wasn't really clear how exactly Argentina was going to dollarize if he were to become president, because his economic team was split. There were at least two opposing plans to dollarize, and so it was all very complex. Nobody knew what a Milei administration would actually look like in terms of economics. So that sort of triggered that panic back then.
Yeah, and I want to talk with you a little bit more later in depth about dollarization and some of his policies and how those could be implemented without the kind of complete disaster that people were fearing and sparked that panic. But first, let's return to the election results for just a moment. As you mentioned, the front runner or the top finisher here, Massa, got about almost 37% of the vote. Milei, 29.9% of the vote, almost 30%. And then Bullrich with almost 24%. So actually a fairly even split between the three. Could you just explain to us the difference between these three top finishing parties and candidates?
Yeah, so basically, in Sergio Massa, you find the representative of the current administration. He is the Minister of Economy. He is sort of like the shadow president, if you will, because our president has largely gone out of stage. He's doing nothing really. Nobody really cares about what the president is doing since like the beginning of this year, when he announced that he was not going to go for re-election. He's deeply unpopular. But Massa represents the Peronist Party, that of Juan Domingo Perón, who back in the 40s and the 50s introduced populist policies, which it's hard to explain because the Peronist Party has many faces. Some of them tend to be leftist, some of them tend to be rightist, and Massa is a perfect example of that. Massa actually started his political career in a center-right party, in a sort of libertarian party, really, back in the late 80s. And there are some people who still remember him, as defending economic liberty, like strongly, very strongly. But after joining the Peronist Party, he sort of defended whoever the Peronist in charge was, which made him actually oppose, Nestor and Cristina Kirchner, who were presidents from 2003 to 2015. He was a minister for that government. He then resigned. He ran as a presidential candidate against Kirchner's candidate. So he's been going back and forth, between leftist and rightist positions. Right now, he's the representative of the left in Argentina, of the center left. But this volatility.
Can I just jump in though? So I feel like in order to even attempt to begin to understand Argentine politics, you need to understand what exactly the Peronists are, and the fact that there's kind of a few different groups of them, a few different buckets that they can be sorted into. And then you also, frankly, kind of need to understand the legacy of the Kirchners. So is there a way you can try to put these in terms that American audiences will understand? We don't have to get into the weeds of fully understanding the differences between every sect of Peronist, but what exactly, are these political groups?
Right. So the Peronist Party, I think it can be basically described as the Workers' Party of Argentina, right? Perón attempted to represent workers back in the 40s, back in the 50s. The policy measures that he introduced back then were highly populist, high public spending, running fiscal deficits. This is where the chronic problem of inflation started in Argentina. And all of this was done with the intent of improving the quality of life of the poorest. But then, of course, it had the reverse effect of causing these inflation crisis, devaluation of the currency, which impoverishes the poor the most. And so Perón himself, he was a populist at times, and then he sort of went back and said, okay, this is a time where we need to stop. We need to stop with fiscal deficits. We need to stop with public spending, because otherwise this is all going to hell. And so people would just follow him, wherever he went, whenever he became more populist or less populist. Then after he died,
he was also exiled, right?
He was exiled. Yeah, he was. Yeah. I mean, he himself was part of a coup who gained power in the early 40s, but he was ousted by the military too in the mid 50s. He then went back in the early 70s. He died in 1974. After that, there was no clear successor in the Peronist Party. And Nestor Kirchner, moving forward, to the 2000s, he sort of claimed to be Perón's successor, a representative of the workers. Yeah.
I think it's also worth including the fact that, like, it is hard for American audiences, correct me if I'm wrong at any point, it is hard for American audiences to understand the full Perón cult of personality, whether it is Perón himself or his wife Evita or his third wife, I believe Isabel. So after he was even exiled and living in Spain for a while, I mean, basically his wife, Isabel, who had been the vice president, was sort of installed as the president. And then when he died, she sort of succeeded him. And so to some degree, you have these three people with the last name Perón who are just exercising vast influence and power over all of Argentina for, I mean, 3 decades longer.
Yeah.
It's kind of stunning that, like, I think sometimes American audiences don't fully grasp the intense cult of personality.
No. I mean, the cult of personality that Perón implemented was extremely deep. Like, you still have people today, people in their 80s, 90s, remembering how they were forced to learn about Perón and Evita in school. And, they remember being forced to read books that said, Perón loves you, Evita loves you. Evita is what's best for the people because, she gives us food, she gives us bicycles, she gives us whatever. Like, the cult of personality was really, really important. And as you mentioned, Perón made both his wives his running mates, in the 50s and the 70s. This is why when he died, Isabel Perón was then put in charge. Of course, she had no power. The only reason why she was there was because she was Perón's wife. But yeah, it's true. He actually ran a campaign that was, vote for Perón, because, he was Perón and his wife was Perón. So the cult of personality, the authoritarianism was very high. He incarcerated political opponents back in the 50s. He seized media outlets. The largest newspaper, the biggest newspaper in Argentina, La Prensa, was shut down and was forced to go from, at a time it was forced to just print, like 2 or 3 pages a day because the government wouldn't give it paper, to print on. It's kind of like Venezuela in the early 2000s. Well, we experienced that back in the 1950s in Argentina with Perón. He was a very authoritarian figure. I think Zach was going to say something.
So yeah, well, when Milei is railing against the political caste, he's positioned himself as an insurgent candidate and anti-establishment candidate. This is really who he's railing against. Is this what grew out of the Perón movement? He even talks about just this like revolving door of family members and connected cronies. Is that more or less what he's talking about? Is that movement?
In a sense, it is. I mean, to continue, with the timeline, you then get to the 2000s, and that's where Nestor Kirchner claims to be, Perón's successor, and he does the same thing that Perón did in the 1950s. He does it just slightly different, but in a sense, it's the same thing. He leaves the presidency, but names his wife as his successor, basically. Of course, now, Kirchner did not incarcerate opponents. He did not seize media outlets. He's still sort of engaged in, passive aggressive intimidation campaigns against his opponents, but it wasn't like a big deal, and the people were the ones who voted for his wife. But in a sense, it was kind of like the same thing that Perón had done some decades ago. So you have Kirchner, then you have Cristina Kirchner, particularly after Nestor Kirchner died in 2010. She became the leader, and from that point, from 2010, she became the undisputable leader of Peronism. And here's the thing, it's very tricky for other Peronists to try to counter her, to oppose her, because she retains the support of something like 20 or 25% of the population. And so that's not enough to win an election, which is why she has not stood for election, for example, this time. But it is key in terms of the primaries. If you don't get Cristina Kirchner's support, you don't get a Peronist candidate. So Massa, to round out the explanation about Massa, he ran against, Cristina Kirchner in 2013. He lost. But then in 2019, after President Macri had governed, but was deemed a failure, so it was clear that he was going to lose re-election, Massa rejoined Cristina Kirchner, and they both installed current President Alberto Fernandez in the presidency. So Massa sort of waited his time, and he waited and waited until Cristina Kirchner became sort of weak enough so that she could not oppose him as he wanted to run for president. Then what happened was, a year ago, the Minister of Economy resigned. There was one of many runs against the peso. Inflation was skyrocketing too, and Massa took charge. Massa was offered the Ministry of Economy. He accepted, and from that point on, it became clear that he was going to be the candidate of the Peronist or the Workers' Party. So he's now representing the left.
Well, let me ask this, because, if he's been the Minister of Economy this entire time, that Argentina's economy is essentially melted down, how is he even, how does anyone even perceive him as a credible candidate given what's unfolded?
This is going to sound paradoxical, but his lack of credibility is actually a plus for him at this point. Because there are some people, I'm being totally serious, because many people, like my dad thinks this. My dad thinks, and many people think, that Massa will get rid of Kirchner's, within the Peronist Party, and then he will take a right turn as he becomes president and will do the things that he's supposed to do. He will open up the economy gradually. He will, actually implement fiscal adjustment, but with the key support of the Workers' Party, which, if it were to be opposed to him, it would cause him, a very serious headache. So there are many people believing that Massa is a sort of faux candidate, that he's not the true Workers' Party candidate, that people who like Cristina Kirchner are being forced to vote for him because there's no alternative, because their administrations had been so bad that Cristina Kirchner cannot run for an election again, but that Massa is actually going to, stab them in the back like he did in the past, and he will create, his own movement within Peronism that will just, get rid of Kirchnerism once and for all. So that's about Massa.
They think he's like a wolf in sheep's clothing, to use an expression in English, like somebody who's going to come in, like he doesn't authentically believe these things. I mean, even his role, wasn't he serving in Cristina Kirchner's government in 2008, 2009? Like, do they think that he's just been lying or playing it cool this entire time? Is that like an authentically held belief?
And to give you a bit more of context, that is credible because it has sort of happened in the past. Really? Back in the 1990s, back in the 1990s, we had a Peronist president called Carlos Menem, and during the 90s, Argentina experienced one of the most impressive liberalization moments, of its history. But Menem actually won his presidential campaign back in 1989, promising, populist policies, that he would be the defender of protectionism, that he would increase handouts, that he would increase public spending. And then he started out his government. He was actually running amid a hyperinflation. And after he took office, he produced a second hyperinflation. But after that, he sort of turned completely, and he became the champion of free market in Argentina, and he deregulated significantly Argentina's economy. He privatized many state-owned companies. he lowered public spending significantly for a while at least, and he got rid of inflation. Inflation was a chronic problem back then, and he decided to peg the peso to the dollar, and in that way he basically eliminated inflation. And so this happened in the 90s. So many people now, and now, moving to Milei, this is why many people, think that, it's complicated, but I'll try to make it easy. Many people fear and other people desire that this happens again, that either Massa becomes the new Menem, which I'm not sure if that can happen, or that if Milei wins, then he will do the same thing that Menem did, that he will get rid of inflation by taking this drastic measure of dollarizing the economy. So many people have,
there's a certain craziness to the fact that people almost semi-conspiratorially believe that Massa will do that if elected, even though he's not saying that he's going to do that. But Milei, the person who is more explicitly saying that he is interested in dollarization, they don't believe that that will actually happen. Like, there's a little bit of double think that's happening there, right?
Yeah, there is. And so now moving to Milei and Bullrich, for example, the main criticism of Milei's, political structure or candidacy, if you will, is that he doesn't have the people. He doesn't have the required expertise. He doesn't have the teams to govern the Argentine state, which is large, and it requires a lot of high-ranking officials. One of the criticisms of Milei is that he has no people, basically, that he only jumped into politics 2 years ago, and that it's just him, and maybe 10 or 15 people in the shadows, but that they can't really govern. Even if they say, they want to deregulate, they want to, because they're talking in more extreme terms than back in the 90s. Milei is saying, instead of privatizing state-owned companies, we just need to shut many of them down, because if we privatize them, another government will then seize them, and get them back to the state. So we just need to get rid of this problem once and for all. The same thinking goes for inflation. If we try to institute, an independent chairman of our central bank, of our Federal Reserve, then, a potential leftist government will be able to ruin things if they pick a dependent president. So let's just get rid of the peso and adopt a dollar, and we will not have this problem. So Milei's stances are more extreme than ever before, for Argentine standards. But the criticism is that he doesn't have the expertise to do it. That was the advantage of the Bullrich campaign. Bullrich was third now. She got 23% of the vote, and she represented former President Macri's coalition, Juntos por el Cambio. She was the Minister of Security back then, which is why her expertise was not the economy. She was criticized for that because the main problem in Argentina right now is the economy, and she did not seem to understand sometimes just how bad the debt problem was, for example, or the inflation problem was. But the key advantage that she had was that she had that team. She sort of inherited the structure of former President Macri, who was in power between 2015 and 2019, and she got Macri support. And Macri said, for example, when he justified his support, he said that Milei has good ideas for the economy, but he will not be able to actually implement them. He doesn't know how to do it. He's just too new. Whereas Patricia Bullrich, has been in politics for a long time. She was part of my administration. She knows how to implement change. So even if her discourse is not as extreme or as radical as Milei, she will be able to implement change. People did not buy that. She lost. But now, I'm not sure if the audience is aware of this. Bullrich went on TV with Milei last night, and she announced her support for him. So we'll see what happens, really.
It was rude of her to do that when we had already prepared for this live stream. We had to change it up, and I just really dislike when politicians inconvenience me like that.
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Zach?
Bullrich, you would describe as a center-right candidate, more or less. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we were in Europe, I would call her a social democrat, to be honest.
Okay.
I know Bullrich personally. I've known her for a decade or so. I've never seen her talk about economic liberty. I've never seen her really care about, free markets or privatization or, right now she was closer to us, to libertarians, because she advocated for, at least fiscal balance, because that's the root of Argentina's inflation problem. And she was definitely closer to maybe not a libertarian standpoint, but a rational standpoint on economics, which is why many people wanted to vote for her. Right now, she does represent the center right, but the Juntos por el Cambio coalition is composed of many parties. She is the chairman of the PRO party, which is Macri's party, basically. I would call that a center right party, but then there are other parties who are center left, actually. Like the Unión Cívica Radical, which announced also yesterday that they will not support either candidate for the runoff. So nor Massa nor Milei, and then there's a third party, which is also center-left, which also announced that they will not be supporting Milei nor Massa. But this is significant because it indicates that coalition may be breaking up after this election.
That's very interesting. And I pulled up, I was looking at this is older polling data from May of this year. This was done by the Economist Intelligence, and they were comparing support for Javier Milei by political affiliation. And obviously among libertarians, he's got strong support. Down, the other one I've got highlighted here is Bullrich's party, and the support is tepid, but what I noticed is that the strongly against is only 25%. So just looking at this as an outsider, that would look, combined with Bullrich's endorsements, pretty good for Milei going into the runoff. Like there's a high chance that a lot of that support would break for him. Am I right about that, or am I missing something in looking at these numbers and the situation with the endorsement?
I think you're right. I think most Bullrich votes will go to Milei. I'm just not sure up to which point he will command an overwhelming majority within the Juntos por el Cambio coalition. But he needs that, because Massa got 37% of the vote. Then you have if you pull up the initial slide, with the results, I can point to another Peronist candidate, Juan Schiaretti, who you see in the fourth place there. He got 7% of the vote. Those votes are likely to go to Massa, just because Schiaretti is also a Peronist, but he has always been anti-Kirchnerist, and he would not join Massa for this election. It is true that his running mate was sort of flirting publicly with Milei, but I would expect those votes to go to Massa. And then the fifth candidate was the far left representative. That's only a 3%, but in a runoff, when you're going from 37% up, that 3% could be key. So if those votes go to Massa, then Milei is going to need an overwhelming majority of the Bullrich's voters, and that's I don't think that's guaranteed. I think he will get a majority of those votes, but the indication that two of the three parties that compose Juntos por el Cambio, that the announcement that they will not endorse any candidates, I think that's going to hurt him. It's true that those are the two least important parties in the coalition. The most important is by far PRO, because Bullrich belongs to pro, Macri belonged to pro, and so their support is key. But Milei needs all of the support he needs if he's going to get to the presidency. And right now, I don't think we have any available polls just because the election was on Sunday. I think the first polls will likely see something of a tie, between Massa and Milei. So I think this is going to be very close.
Did you want to go to some audience questions, Zach?
Yes, there's quite a few that have come in. One is from Naram Shanmuk. Says Massa is not center left. He's a left wing populist. From what you were describing, it sounded to me like I think these terms get a little confusing across in different contexts, because populist, well, giving out a bunch of goodies ahead of the election, that's a populist move. Here in America, we tend to think of populism as anti-establishment figures, but it's a little muddled here because he's part of the establishment, but he's also a populist. But
Right.
And I don't know that Milei, he's often described as a populist. I don't know that he is a populist, but he's anti-establishment. Is there anything else you want to add to the understanding of these terms? Yeah.
People also describe Milei as like a fascist, or in keeping with Bolsonaro, which is sort of not my understanding of the policies that Milei is promoting. I think people are very imprecise with their labels.
Yeah. So in terms of labeling, Massa is definitely the establishment candidate. I mean, he's been in politics for decades. He's actually calling for a government of national unity. He's actually courting these parties, these Juntos por el Cambio parties that will not endorse Milei. He's trying to get them, to be part of a potential government by him. I would call Massa a populist, definitely, because of the measures that he took, that he's taking. And I think at this point, he represents basically all of the left in Argentina, the center left, but also the far left, and the left just left, because with the far left candidate out for the runoff, anyone who feels leftist will vote for him. But again, I think Massa has switched, skins in the past. He has been rightist, he has been leftist, and many people think he can actually, make another 180 degree turn. So we don't really know what's going to happen. And then you were talking about Milei as sort of a Bolsonaro or Trumpish figure. That's a very interesting discussion. I understand why many people have compared Milei to Trump or Bolsonaro. I am not sure that comparison is completely accurate, because neither Trump nor Bolsonaro were self-described anarcho-capitalists. It's not that Milei. Right. It's not that Milei, calls himself just a classical liberal or a libertarian. Like, he's called himself an anarcho-capitalist, and of course he has made very questionable alliances. His running mate, for example, she's I would call her a conservative nationalist. I think if you ask her about, for example, globalization, she would likely be opposed to globalization or free trade or fiscal adjustment. And I don't think she's libertarian at all. I'm still struggling to understand why Milei would pick her as her running mate. There are some theories, that he needed someone that was not as histrionic as him to accompany him, and she was the only person available that would sort of court, richer voters. Because
I think really it's that we have a shortage of libertarian women. I mean, there's like 4 of us that exist, right? Like, right. He has sort of slim pickings,
Let me bring up one more question.
That happens in Argentina too.
From Robert Weed says, are any steps being taken to prevent fraud before the next election? How big a concern is that? Is that something that's plagued Argentina in the past?
I don't think there are many steps being taken to prevent fraud before this election. Argentina's electoral system is a bit tricky, and it is in need of reform, of urgent reform, just because, for example, the ballots with which we vote, we don't have just one ballot where we cross the candidate that we want or something like that. Each party, each candidate needs to provide the state basically with their own ballots, and they're sort of responsible for those ballots to appear in all of the schools in the country, basically. So that requires a logistical, structure that is very hard to get, particularly for lesser known parties or for new parties, and that has always given Peronism an advantage over others. And also, the other way in which the system is tricky is that there are not always representatives of all parties in all of the schools of the country, and so vote counting could be altered. And we are seeing actually in very backward provinces in Argentina, like Santiago del Estero, one of the poorest provinces of the country, where I would even call their governor like a local dictator, basically, because it's basically that. In those kind of provinces, we are seeing, for example, vote counts where Peronism gets 100% of the vote in one school, which is just, it's statistically impossible. Like it just can't be, I don't think that can turn the result of the election, but it is a concern, and I don't think there are being any steps being taken, to solve it, just because the government in charge is Peronism. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't count on the government, really.
I want to take us to one more question and then we'll move on. This one's from Joseph van Wagner. Why is reason in general so watered down on libertarian messaging? Y'all are basically beltway libertarians, not in touch with the movement as a whole. I cannot resist defending Reason's honor, especially because this is kind of unrelated to the thing that we're actually talking about.
This is a question for you guys.
I know, right?
We'll field this one. Just
one point of clarification that I would add is, we're awful beltway libertarians. I'm literally sitting in Queens in New York City, and Zach is sitting in his house in Florida. So if we are beltway libertarians, we're extremely bad at it because neither Zach nor I spend any time in the beltway.
I have to zoom in for the cocktail parties. So
yeah. No, but I mean, I think that this is such like a weird strain of critique, and we get these types of messages all the time. I mean, I don't really understand what the specific complaint is here. I think taking the Milei candidacy seriously is not watered down libertarianism. Honestly, I like the vast majority of things I hear coming out of his mouth. He sometimes phrases things in a little bit more of a blunt, brusque, Trumpy type way. But you know what? It's not very off-putting to me. I really appreciate how much of a straight shooter he is. And I'm sorry, but we're fundamentally a journalistic outlet. I think it's important to be engaging with international candidates and trying to take this comparative lens seriously, and then actually talking to political experts on the ground, like Marcos Falcone, in order to understand what exactly is going on and what these dynamics look like. So, I mean, if you don't really like Reason's style and you think we're too beltway centric, that's on you. But there's a lot of issues with that strain of critique, and I don't really understand what you want us to be doing instead, or how we ought to be engaging with Milei's candidacy differently. I, for one, am very interested in it. And I'm sorry, but like, this is what journalism is, and absolutely in no way dismissing Milei as some Trump or Bolsonaro copycat. I think we're taking him seriously and actually trying to do something different than what a lot of the media is doing in their coverage of him, where they sort of paint him as a far-right candidate or a populist or a fascist or a libertarian, as if libertarian is a dirty word. I mean, we are libertarians. We don't believe it's a dirty word, and we see him as pretty distinct from those other candidates.
Yeah, and he recently, I want to get to some of those exciting Milei clips, because I agree with you, Liz. There's a lot to like there. It's hard not to watch it as a libertarian and get the old blood pumping. We've got a few clips from his recent appearance on Tucker Carlson's show on X.com in September, following his first place finish. For our audio only listeners, these are going to be dubbed in English, but first, I want to ask you a question about this in a moment, where he explains his animosity towards socialism. Let's run that clip.
Es decir, eso es lo que quiero que quede claro. Los socialistas tienen las manos manchadas de sangre. Todo el tiempo tienen manchadas las manos de sangre. No les alcanzó con...
Are you arguing that socialists commit bloodshed because they believe they are God?
Porque ellos se creen que son Dios. Es decir, son unos herejes. Es decir, por eso Hayek en su último libro esto lo llamó la fatal arrogancia. Es decir, porque para coordinar todo este tipo de acciones, la cantidad de conocimiento que hay que tener, y eso está vinculado a otro artículo de Hayek que se llama El uso del conocimiento en la sociedad, donde da una forma más científica y profunda de la idea de la mano invisible, de Adam Smith. Lo que dice es que para poder aplicar el socialismo es necesario que las personas que lo hagan deban ser omniscientes, omnipresentes y omnipotentes. Es decir, creen que son Dios. Y le voy a contar algo. No son Dios. Y les voy a decir algo peor. Son tan miserables y tan rastreros los políticos, y en especial los de izquierda, que además están debajo de las personas promedio. Porque solamente, ¿quién va a pretender ser igual al promedio? Solo el que está por debajo. Por lo tanto, es la agenda de los envidiosos. La envidia es un pecado capital. De eso nada bueno puede salir. Del asesinato nada bueno puede salir. Del robo nada puede salir.
It's exciting to hear a political candidate pulling from Hayek books and essays and packaging it in this really fiery attitude. But how much do you think that these really visceral ideological attacks on socialism explain his appeal in Argentina? Is that something that actually resonates with the average voter?
So I think that resonates with his base, and I think that there's a very interesting feature in that clip, which is the sort of Christian language that he uses when he talks about heretics and capital sins.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm not sure about this, but I think this is part of a strategy in which Milei is trying to sort of appeal to religious people. Because he knows that if they believe in him, they will follow him, no matter what. And that's, I think he considers that important for his political campaign. But I understand how that could make a lot of people think that he's not a true libertarian, that he's actually a Trumpian candidate or a Bolsonaro version of Argentina. But I think, going back to the question of his, ideology and what does that have to do with his success, I would say that Milei owes his success mostly to Argentina's failed economic policies, really, because we are in a country that has not grown in something like 15 years. We've been going from recession to recession. Inflation has been, increasing year to year, and people feel like they have tried it all. That they have tried Peronism, that they have tried anti-Peronism back when Macri was in power, and that nothing has worked. And so, people, for example, young people, a boy who's like 20 years old, he was born in 2003. Everything he's seen, everything this person remembers of Argentina's political life and economic life is failure, And so what they're thinking is, what does my future look like in this country? It doesn't look good, And so this person, what they want is they want to leave Argentina. And we're actually seeing that, I have many, many friends who have gone abroad, and many don't think that they will return to Argentina. And
where did they
you
go?
see, well, they go. So in Argentina, it's typical that many people have some sort of European citizenship,
Yeah.
because of our heritage. Many people have an Italian passport or a Spanish passport, and so they go to Europe. Some of
Or
them go to the
German, but
US
we don't
too.
talk about that. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's true. That's true too. But an overwhelming majority is either Italian or Spanish. There are
Yeah.
some Germans too, but they're not as many. Some people go to
Imagine
the US,
how
but that's
imagine
yeah.
how bad of an economic situation it must be to be like, I'm gonna leave Argentina and go to Italy or Spain, right? Like not exactly countries known for their industriousness and productivity and participation in the labor
Right.
force, right? Like not
Right,
ideal,
right,
but
right.
apparently better.
Yeah. So I think, Milei feeds on that basically,
Mhm.
on the lack of hope of the people. And that's why he sort of presents himself as a savior, basically. And this
Yeah.
can be, interpreted in religious terms too. He's never going to present himself as God, of course, and he's criticizing people who think that they're God, but he's sort of, trying to present himself to people, and particularly lower class people who have lost all hope, that he will restore, Argentina. And you can see when I talk about this, I think I even think about how this can be related to Trump, when he was talking about, make America great again. I think, well, you guys know more about Trump than I do. I don't think America was never great, really. But in this case, it is true that Argentina has lost something. Argentina
Mm.
used to be one of the richest countries in the world, and now it's just average, basically. We don't do that
His
well.
attempt to lay this at the feet of socialism and socialists, is that something that excites people, or that they resonate
Right.
with? Is that something that kind of haunts the political landscape, whatever effect socialism has had on Argentina? Because I know we talked about Peronism, and it's a little different. It's this kind of hybrid, but how does that factor into the political landscape?
Right. So I think his campaign against socialism, everything he says against socialism, is something that, of course, he believes,
Mhm.
and that his base also believes, particularly the young people, students, people under 25 or under 30. I don't think that's something that resonates among lower class people. For
Mm.
them, I think the message that Milei is getting to them is that whatever is happening to them is the fault of the political establishment, which he calls casta.
Right.
Caste may be the word in English. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Um, but he talks about the political caste. He tells people that everything is the fault of the political caste, and that he is coming to drain the swamp. Like Trump did
Right.
back then in the U.S. Um, his message against socialism, in particular, I think that excites a few people, not the majority of his voters, but a key group that is, for example, the group that takes the lead on social media, the group
Yeah.
that sort of sets the agenda on social media. And so when you go on Argentine social media, you will see that influencers, for example, that like Milei and talk against socialism are hugely popular, which is
Yes.
strange, because that's not a thing outside of social media, really.
Yeah.
And it makes it look like it's this generalized thing, this generalized opposition to socialism, which I
Yeah.
don't think exists,
So
but I wish
that
it
might be,
existed.
yeah,
Right.
that might be what I've been exposed to, is just these social media influencers, the memes, the chainsaws, which I want to talk about, because
Right.
his fan, there he is on the cover of in an AP article wielding a chainsaw. His supporters, there's videos of them running chainsaws. I even saw a guy with a chainsaw mask, like walking into the voting booth. The
Yeah.
title of this article for our listeners is "A Man, a Plan, a Chainsaw." And that's because Milei has presented something called the Chainsaw Plan. Here, this quote at the beginning, to your point, he says, "The cast is trembling," he yells while brandishing a chainsaw. And he presented the Chainsaw Plan in central Cordoba province in June 2022. It is his blueprint for the wholesale reform of the state to slash public spending, scrap half the government's ministries, sell state-owned companies, and eliminate the central bank. That all sounds pretty good to a libertarian. If he is elected, what are the political realities? How much of that, of his agenda, do you believe that he could accomplish?
Well, that's a good question, because it's key to what many voters are considering when thinking about voting for Milei. The reality is that if he gets elected president, his party will not have more than 15% of Congress seats, neither in the House of Representatives nor in the Senate. So he will command a minority, and not even the first one. The first minority will be the Peronist Party. Then you will have the Juntos por el Cambio coalition, if it still exists, and otherwise you will have many small parties. And then you get his. So he will not have more than 15% of all Congress people, which is going to be a problem for sure if he doesn't cut any alliances. Now the question is, after Bullrich's endorsement last night, and we're expecting an endorsement by a formal endorsement by President Macri, he hasn't formally endorsed him, but not officially yet. If he cuts an alliance with them, he may increase the size of his legislative group, but it's going to be hard for him to form majorities in Congress. And then there's the question of who would be part of his team, of his economic team, who would be his ministers, his Minister of Economy, for example. We don't really know much about that. There's some expectation that an alliance with Bullrich and Macri will provide him with the kind of people he needs, people with the expertise, people who know what the challenges inside the state are. But it's unclear really what would happen. Also, because after he won the August primaries, and there was this panic, in markets, he sort of backed down in a way from his proposals, because before that he was talking about dollarization, but there were no specifics in the program, and it just seemed like he would dollarize the economy on day one, But after the August primary, and to try to calm everyone down, he said, dollarization is something that will happen not in the long term, but not immediately either, like in 12 months or 24 months, and there will be a transition period and things will be smooth, so as to not hurt people. So in a way, it's unclear exactly what he will do and with whom he will do all of his proposals, which is what's scaring people now. Many people on the center right are thinking, well, the election is over. Even if I vote for Milei, he's probably going to lose. But if he wins, he will not be able to do anything. So many people, what I sense these days is a lot of sadness, on the center right, just because Milei didn't do better on the Sunday election, and because the math doesn't really add up, neither for the runoff nor for a potential administration. But Argentina is like a Pandora box. Everything changes significantly, week to week, so everything could change.
How much autonomy, or how much cooperation would he need in order to push what's really the central proposition of his campaign, the dollarization, the abolition of the central bank? Is that something he would have much leeway in doing, even if he had a uncooperative legislature? And is there a way, we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but is there a way to implement dollarization, do you think, that would not create the sort of nightmare scenario that spooked the markets?
Well, the alternative, to hyperinflation, if you want to dollarize, is to borrow money, basically. And now that's where Milei's capacity to attract investments gets sort of called into question. If Milei, for example, were to seal, an alliance, an executive alliance with Bullrich or Macri, then those people may be able to convince, investors to lend the Argentine state money so that the state actually has some dollars, to dollarize, and so that the exchange rate doesn't need to go through the roof. That's the alternative. It will require that the state take a lot of debt. It's unclear whether Milei would be able to do that, and if he were to do that, then he would have to proceed with his fiscal adjustment plan much more quickly than expected, because he would have to pay that debt down, of course, and the state is already indebted, so that would be a problem. And what was the first question? I forgot about that. Sorry.
It was just, how much buy-in does he need from
the
legislature to do it?
And he needs, and I'm not sure about technicalities. I think that he may have people on his legal team trying to figure out whether he could bypass Congress for many of the proposals that he wants to implement. I'm not sure he can do that. Argentine presidents do get a lot of leeway through decrees, but there are some areas in which it is constitutionally forbidden to issue decrees. I'm not sure if monetary policy fits into one of those categories. I don't think so, but it's likely that if Milei does something that Congress doesn't like, Congress does have the authority to override a decree. If Congress gets 2/3 of a majority, then they can override whatever it is that the government is trying to do. And so if that's the case, and Milei can't get 1/3 of Congress to support him, then he would be in danger. He would be, in my view, the most important danger that he would face as president is that he would get impeached. Impeachment would be a real possibility, because if he only has 15% of the vote, he's just, whatever he does that the opposition doesn't like, they will turn that into grounds for impeachment, and they will impeach him for sure. If he's unpopular enough, of course. If the opposition thinks that it will be in their benefit to impeach Milei, they will do it. That's, of course, assuming he will actually get elected president. But I think that's his biggest concern right now should be that, really, because the election for Congress has been done already. That's not going to change with the runoff, and he will just not have many Congress people. So that's what I would be focusing on right now: how to avoid impeachment on day one or day two.
Yeah. That's the political climate and uncertainty presents a lot of issues for Milei that I think is making some libertarians nervous. There's been there's a lot of excitement among libertarians about Milei, because when else do you see a guy like this, who's the head of a presidential race, spitting Hayek and Mises, on the brink of winning the presidency. But there's been a little bit of pushback in some quarters, some of it because of some social conservatism, which we can talk about, but some of it because of a fear of how he might react to his political opposition. There's another clip from the Tucker Carlson interview that this brings to mind, where he is asked what happens if there is a backlash and there are riots once he implements these radical plans. Let's play that.
There's this enormous state workforce, government workforce in Argentina, but you said that you would not lay them off immediately until you built up the private sector economy, because you worried there would be violent protests. Are you worried that there will be violent protests or violence against your supporters over the next month before the election?
No me preocupa, porque yo voy a gobernar con la ley en la mano. y la ley en mi gobierno se va a cumplir y el que las hace las paga. Y además no tendrían por qué quejarse porque, digamos, no van a ser afectados en las reformas de primera generación. Y cuando tomen lugar las reformas de segunda generación, ellos mismos van a dejar de lado esos trabajos en el sector público por una cuestión de incentivos, por una cuestión de remuneración. Por lo tanto, no debería ser un problema. Pero si aún así quisieran hacer problemas, nosotros vamos a aplicar la ley. Y aquellos que cometan disturbios y aquellos que violen la ley, los vamos a meter presos.
A little smirk at the end from Tucker Carlson. One of the fears that Gloria Alvarez expressed on our last stream talking about Milei is that she's worried he could end up acting like another Pinochet and start getting violent and authoritarian and tarnish libertarianism in Latin America. How concerned are you by that prospect?
I'm not that concerned, to be honest. I do think Milei has some psychological, issues. I do peculiarities.
How dare you say that about our favorite tantric sex coach? Come on.
I mean, and how dare I say that among libertarians who are very sane always,
Yeah,
right?
Very normal.
Yeah.
Very normal.
Very
people.
normal. I think, I do ask myself sometimes how Milei would face opposition and what he would actually do, as a person. How would he try to react to opposition? But I think institutions in Argentina are very strong, and I don't think he would pose a threat to democracy at all or to our republican system, just because of the weakness that he would have from day one. I was talking about how he's not going to have more than 15% of Congress people, so he could be impeached any second. We know that people on the Supreme Court, justices don't like him, so they could also strike whatever it is that he does down. Of course, people within the state, people who work for Argentina's government, some of them are, people who have led professional careers over decades, but many of them are also people who have been appointed by the Peronist administrations who will try to, boycott Milei from day one. So I really don't think that he will pose a threat to our system. I do worry, that about him, as a person, about how he's going to feel if he can't do what he wants to do. But I don't think that's a problem for the system necessarily.
That's a really good point. Like, the greater threat might be just that he ends up being kind of inept at implementing the things that he wants to, but not necessarily that he, in any way encroaches on sort of rule of law the way that people are claiming. I want to bring us to yet another clip from the Tucker Carlson interview. Alas, despite possible disdain for Tucker Carlson, which I sometimes feel, it was a really interesting and thorough interview with Milei. I think Milei was especially fascinating in it because Tucker kind of continuously pushes him to almost be more of a Trump-like figure. And Milei kind of demurs on that and says, no, I'm a libertarian, I'm a capitalist, and sort of repeatedly brings up Hayek and stuff like that, which is clearly sort of not what Tucker is wanting. But this clip was about abortion. And I think this is an interesting thing to explore because many libertarians are very divided on this issue. And I know this is pretty big in Argentine politics. Zach, can you bring that one up?
Así que lo voy a decir como libertario. Nosotros creemos que el liberalismo es el respeto irrestricto del proyecto de vida del prójimo, basado en el principio de no agresión y en defensa del derecho a la vida, a la libertad y a la propiedad. Por lo tanto, adhiriendo a las ideas de la libertad, básicamente, una de las ideas fundamentales es defender el derecho a la vida. O sea, filosóficamente estoy a favor de respetar el derecho a la vida. Después hay una justificación desde el plano de vista de las ciencias naturales, digamos, que es el hecho de que la vida comienza en el momento de la fecundación. Y en ese mismo momento se genera un nuevo ser en evolución, ¿sí?, con un ADN distinto. Es decir, es cierto que la mujer tiene derechos sobre su cuerpo, pero ese niño dentro del vientre no es su cuerpo.
To me, this so succinctly sums up how I look at it, because I am a pro-life libertarian, and I understand many libertarians begin to feel very concerned when you get into questions of, well, if you do believe these things, then what role does the state have in restricting somebody's ability to get an abortion? And are there any second-order impacts that could stem from making something illegal when it is so prevalent in both the U.S. and in Argentina? And we want to learn from the harms of prohibition in other realms. And so a lot of libertarians, even if they maybe feel a little personally pro-life, have trepidation about the state getting involved in this. Marcos, how do you think this plays with voters in Argentina? Is this something that turns off a bunch of libertarians or would-be supporters? Is this something that turns off young people, or is this actually playing pretty well?
I think this was actually part of his strategy to appeal to religious voters, particularly because there was a first attempt in 2018 to pass a federal law that would allow for abortion to be, legal and free for all. That was rejected by Congress. Back then, Milei was not as important, of course, as he is now, but he opposed it, and I think he tried to rally, religious voters behind him in doing so. That is, besides, his actual beliefs, he does believe he is a pro-life libertarian too. And then I think it was 2020, or it might have been 2021, when the abortion law was finally passed. Abortion is now legal in Argentina.
Abortion for the first 14 weeks, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And women can get that in any public hospital for free of charge, basically, or with the taxpayers paying, basically.
Yeah.
But I think this has been good for him to rally, to build a base, basically, which is not necessarily composed of libertarians. I mean, it's not necessarily entirely comprised of libertarians, but does also have, conservatives and nationalists. And I think this has been particularly, I mean, his position, his stance on abortion has been particularly good for him to get many votes outside of metropolitan areas. Back in the August primaries, and now also in October, he got many votes in rural areas, in lower income areas. Not that he doesn't really get that many votes in progressive cities. When he jumped into politics in 2021, he got 17% of the vote because he ran for a seat in Congress representing Buenos Aires, the Buenos Aires city. This time around, he also got something like 20% or less of the vote of the city of Buenos Aires, but he keeps getting, something like 40 up to 50% in many provinces that are just, far from Buenos Aires, who are more conservative, and where abortion is still a very contentious issue. Because in the city of Buenos Aires and in metropolitan areas, people just moved on, really, and accepted the fact that abortion is now legal, and nobody's really trying to do anything to repeal that law. But in these provinces, in these provinces where Milei is getting more support, abortion is still an issue, and it will be an issue forever, most likely, because if you're a pro-life person, an anti-abortion person, then you think that basically a genocide is happening in front of you all the time. So this will always be an issue, and that's where he got more votes. So I think, strategically, politically for him, this was good, even if, he can't appeal to all libertarians, because there are, of course, some pro-abortion libertarians. We know here in Argentina that libertarianism is sharply, split in this topic, which is probably the most contentious one, really, in philosophical terms.
Yeah,
Well, I'm a
absolutely.
very pro-life libertarian, but I did want to ask Zach. I know that you and I diverge a little bit on this question, and policy implications aside, what do you make of, like, is Milei's argument at all compelling to you, or does it really turn you off of his ideas?
I mean, look, he's making the strongest philosophical case that you can for being pro-life as a libertarian. I still have disagreements on what, basically my disagreement boils down to at what point is it appropriate for the state to start prioritizing the protection of the fetus over the mother's bodily autonomy. That's really that's the nub of the issue for everyone, and I think we're on opposite sides of where we would say it's appropriate for the state to intervene. The bigger concern for me, that and one that's been expressed, is what you alluded to earlier, Marcos, about the having the libertarian ideas so entangled with the Catholicism and the religion. I mean, part of it might be, those of us who came to libertarianism in the early 2000s or the 90s. It's like we remember the days of the religious right, trying to craft policy here in the United States. So we're very on edge about libertarianism being overly associated with social conservatism. I think with Milei, I've looked into his policy, his statements on social issues, and he's always seems very careful to say, I'm not, I like, I'm not against gay marriage. I just think government should get out of marriage altogether. Or, I'm not, you can become whatever you want to become. I think he says you can become a cougar for all I care. Just don't make me pay for it. So he's taking a strictly libertarian stance on all these hot button social issues. But what Gloria brought up in our last conversation was, well, at the same time, he's not advancing any policies that are libertarian on any of the social issues. He's kind of just saying the philosophically correct thing, but he's not doing anything to expand the liberty of people in these marginalized groups. And that therefore, all of these people who it's important to are never going to get on board with libertarianism if their idea of it is Javier Milei. I don't know. I don't know enough about what's going on in the culture in Argentina to opine on that one way or another, but maybe you do.
No, I agree with you that he's very careful to take the mainstream libertarian approach to all of these questions, and that there have been people criticizing him for not being a libertarian enough. Criticism that I respect, of course, but I also think that libertarianism can house conservative libertarians, people who believe in libertarian principles. Yeah. But would not necessarily adhere, and do not necessarily like the things that people do with their liberties. I think Milei is very careful to respect, as he calls it, the life projects of others. A definition that he took from an Argentine academic, and yeah, I think that's not a problem to me, really. Because I agree with those mainstream libertarian statements, but I understand why that is a problem for others who would want Milei to be, better on that.
I agree with you, by the way, that social conservatives absolutely should be part of the libertarian movement, so long as they are pluralists like the rest of us and don't want to impose their preferences on us by force. And the Milei model is just very interesting to look at from an American perspective, because we are having a lot of these same tensions and discussions in the libertarian movement in the United States. And I think there's a lot to learn from watching the Milei campaign, which is why we're hosting the conversation.
I would also add the slight caveat that, I mean, obviously you're talking about a few things wrapped under the umbrella of being a social conservative. But I would say that at least for me, my pro-life views, and I think many pro-life libertarians feel this way, I'm not conservative. I'm not a social conservative. I am just a staunch libertarian who disagrees about when life begins. And if life begins at conception, then all kinds of policy implications follow. And I see this as such a natural area where if the non-aggression principle applies in all other realms, then if you see a fetus as an innocent and rights-bearing individual, then surely that also applies in that context too. I still want to celebrate your right to do mushrooms. I'm not a social conservative. And so I think there might be a contingent, particularly of younger libertarians, who perhaps feel that way in both the US and in Argentina. I do want to bring
It's a really it's a rapidly evolving issue, especially with the scientific and medical advances. I think it seems like there's an increasing number of people in your camp, Liz, who you can't just divide cleanly into the, religious rights and, left camps that way, based on their view of abortion.
I'm not interested in controlling women's bodies or telling them what they can and cannot do or telling them not to have a good time, right? Like that's
right.
not
Flash
sort
those
of
tattoos.
my angle here. Yeah, exactly, right? Like you can look at my body. I'm interested in giving people lots of bodily autonomy. I do want to bring us to one last question and then close us out here. This one, I'm not sure who it's by, but it says the Tucker Carlson interview should have been at Reason TV. Really disappointed a libertarian presidential candidate wasn't approached by Reason first. Oh, well. Zach, do you know who that one came from?
I'm not seeing that there.
It's by Philippe. By this guy, Philippe.
Okay.
I think that's such a great point. I totally agree. I am bummed that this was done by Tucker Carlson and not by me or Zach or, one of our Reason TV colleagues, our executive producer, Jim Epstein, our head of Reason TV, who actually is totally fluent in Spanish. If the Javier Milei team wants to approach us in any way, I think we've tried to approach them. If they want to do something with Reason TV, I mean, hopefully we have demonstrated in this stream and the last one, we are not interested in just lumping him together with Bolsonaro and Trump. We have a lot of, I think, tough questions. I think a lot of fair questions that we have that have been rattling around in all of our minds. So win or
Let's
lose.
talk after the election, Milei team.
Yeah, we would absolutely be interested. There are a bunch of interesting angles to go down. And frankly, it's a really heartening, kind of exciting thing to see somebody who's so proud of the anarcho-capitalist label, somebody who's so proud of the libertarian label, somebody who names their freaking dogs after free market economists, really taking to the national stage and the international stage. And I think he's talking a lot of sense. We're definitely interested in continuing to follow what's going on in Argentina economically, because this crazy runaway inflation. I mean, we talk about inflation in the US, but then you turn your focus to Argentina for a few seconds and you realize, I mean, this is a massive issue. And for anybody who cares about reining in government spending and ensuring some sort of fiscal prudence going forward, we really, really want to make sure that some of the mistakes in Argentina aren't emulated in the US. And we also kind of care deeply about what happens. I mean, the fact that so many younger Argentines feel like they have to seek other opportunities abroad instead of being able to contribute to Argentina's economy because of how dire the situation is, that's a huge problem. And I think it's important for libertarians to really pay a lot of attention to this. So Marcos Falcone, thank you so much for speaking with Reason. Where can people find your work?
They can go to marcosfalcone.com.ar and they can find everything that I do basically there, links to podcasts, media articles, interviews, my Twitter account, an email address. So all there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Reason TV. Zach Weissmuller and I will be back next week, probably the exact same time with a new stream for you guys. We really appreciate the time.